The loudest celebration I have ever witnessed ended because of one quiet valve no one thought to ask about. I was standing on the grassy hillside overlooking the lake when the ribbon was cut and the crowd erupted into applause. Sunlight danced across the water while dozens of polished boats floated beside a brand new marina stretching proudly into what everyone kept calling the community lake. Music drifted through loudspeakers, children waved small flags along the shoreline, and local reporters moved from one smiling resident to another collecting interviews about what they described as the biggest improvement our neighborhood had ever seen. Karen Mitchell stood near the center of the dock wearing a bright smile that matched the confidence in her voice as she thanked the Homeowners Association, contractors, and volunteers for making the nearly $2 million project a reality. She spoke about vision, community, and the future. She never mentioned the person quietly watching from across the water because, as far as she knew, I was simply another homeowner admiring the celebration. My name is Mason Brooks, and my family had owned this lake long before the first subdivision entrance sign was ever installed beside the county road. My grandfather purchased the surrounding property decades earlier, together with the reservoir rights, the small earthen dam downstream, and the water management permits that had quietly remained in our family ever since. To most people, the lake looked like part of the neighborhood because they had spent years fishing from its shoreline and kayaking across its calm surface. What almost nobody realized was that enjoying a view and owning the water beneath it were two completely different things. I leaned against the weathered fence overlooking the shoreline and listened as another boat eased into its assigned slip for the first time. The polished wooden docks reflected beautifully in the afternoon sun, and I could not deny that the construction crew had done impressive work. Heavy cedar pilings stood perfectly aligned. Stainless steel cleats gleamed beside every berth. Decorative lighting lined the walkways, waiting for sunset to transform the marina into the centerpiece of the community. Everything looked permanent. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked as though it had always belonged there. Less than half a mile away, hidden behind a grove of mature oak trees, sat a small concrete control structure that almost every visitor overlooked. It was not impressive. It had no decorative stonework, no polished railings, and no welcome sign. Just an aging steel access door, a locked control wheel, and a series of engineering markers that quietly measured the water level throughout the year. My grandfather used to bring me there when I was a boy, explaining that the lake depended upon careful management rather than luck. He always smiled before saying that water follows engineering, not opinions. At the time, I thought he was simply teaching me about maintenance. Years later, I finally understood he was teaching me about responsibility. As applause echoed across the marina, I slipped one hand into my jacket pocket where a folded maintenance schedule rested beside copies of permits that had already been approved weeks earlier. The timing had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with routine infrastructure work that had been planned long before the grand opening banners appeared. Watching Karen wave proudly from the end of the dock, I realized she believed the project was finally complete. I knew the real story had not even begun because every celebration built on an assumption eventually reaches the moment when the truth quietly arrives. After the celebration ended and the last applause faded across the water, I drove slowly around the eastern shoreline, following the same gravel road my grandfather had traveled for decades when he inspected the lake after every heavy rain. Nothing about that road had changed. The old oak trees still leaned over the fence line. The weathered survey markers still stood exactly where county crews had placed them years earlier. Even the faded steel gate leading toward the small control structure remained locked with the same heavy chain I had replaced every few seasons as part of regular maintenance. Most residents never noticed it because it sat well away from the walking trails and hidden behind thick vegetation. To them, it looked like an ordinary utility building. To me, it represented the heart of everything surrounding the lake. My grandfather believed that ownership carried responsibilities that lasted far longer than any generation. He never treated the reservoir as a decoration or an investment. He treated it as a working system that required attention, inspections, engineering reports, and cooperation with state and county agencies responsible for water management. When I inherited the property, I inherited every obligation along with it. Every inspection report, every maintenance record, every easement agreement, every engineering drawing, and every water management permit had been carefully preserved inside a climate-controlled archive room at my home. Once each year, I scheduled a complete inspection of the dam, spillway, outlet structures, and monitoring equipment with a licensed hydraulic engineer. The inspection calendar had never changed because someone built new homes nearby. Water systems do not recognize neighborhood politics. They operate according to physics, weather, and maintenance schedules. Several months before the Marina construction began, I had already submitted the annual maintenance notification required under my operating permit. County officials approved the inspection window, environmental staff reviewed the temporary water level adjustment, and downstream property owners received written notice describing the planned release schedule. Everything followed the same procedure that had existed for years. None of those documents mentioned the Marina because it had not yet been announced. At the time, there was simply another routine maintenance cycle approaching, just as there had been every year before it. While contractors spent months driving pilings into the lakebed and assembling floating docks, I quietly continued collecting paperwork without interfering with their work. I requested updated survey maps, confirmed property boundaries through the county recorder, and asked my engineer to verify that every benchmark remained unchanged since the previous inspection. The results never surprised me because the legal boundaries had not moved an inch. What surprised me was discovering that no representative from the Homeowners Association, no contractor, and no project consultant had ever contacted my office regarding construction within the reservoir. There were no access agreements, no shoreline licenses, no construction easements, and no water use authorization requests bearing my signature. I reviewed every file twice because I assumed something that significant could not possibly have been overlooked. Yet the folders remained empty. Standing beside the quiet control structure that evening, I unlocked the inspection cabinet and compared the approved maintenance schedule with the engraved water level gauge mounted along the concrete wall. Everything matched perfectly. The celebration at the Marina had convinced everyone the project was finally complete, but I understood that infrastructure only succeeds when every foundation beneath it has been legally and technically respected. The shoreline reflected the fading sunset with complete calm, and as I closed the inspection logbook, I realized the coming days would not be shaped by emotion or confrontation. They would simply follow the same maintenance plan that had been responsibly prepared long before the first dock section ever touched the water. The following morning began with the same peaceful silence that had always surrounded the reservoir before the neighborhood expanded around it. A light layer of mist floated across the surface while the newly completed marina reflected perfectly in the still water. From a distance it looked impressive, almost as though it had belonged there for years. Boats rested quietly in their slips, decorative lights remained on from the celebration the night before, and banners welcoming residents fluttered gently in the breeze. I parked my truck beside the maintenance road leading to the control structure and unlocked the weathered steel gate with the same brass key my father had carried before me. Inside the small concrete building, everything appeared exactly as it had during every annual inspection. The monitoring instruments displayed stable readings, the inspection log waited on the shelf beside the operating manual, and the control wheel connected to the outlet gate remained secured with its county inspection seal intact. Before touching anything, I checked the approved maintenance packet one final time. The engineering report specified the target water elevation. The county authorization listed the exact inspection window. Environmental monitoring requirements were attached behind it together with notification records confirming that downstream landowners had already received advance notice weeks earlier. Every signature, permit number, and inspection date matched the copies stored in my office. There was nothing unusual about the process because it followed the same routine my family had completed year after year. The only unusual detail was the expensive marina now extending into a reservoir whose operating schedule had never changed for anyone. I slowly unlocked the control assembly and began turning the large steel wheel according to the engineering procedure, pausing after each measured adjustment to confirm the gauges responded within acceptable limits. Deep beneath the surface, water gradually entered the controlled outlet exactly as designed decades earlier. There was no dramatic surge, no sudden roar, and no reckless release. Reservoir management does not work that way. Everything happens gradually because controlled infrastructure depends upon precision rather than speed. By late afternoon, The water level had begun its carefully calculated descent. The floating docks settled lower with the surface while remaining fully supported, and nothing about the marina suggested that anything significant was happening. Residents continued walking along the boardwalk taking photographs of the new facility, completely unaware that the reservoir had quietly entered its scheduled maintenance cycle. I returned home that evening, completed the first inspection report, and filed electronic updates with the engineer responsible for overseeing the project. Shortly after sunrise the next morning, my phone began receiving photographs from neighbors. The shoreline looked completely different. Wide sections of the lakebed that had remained underwater for years were now visible as part of the planned drawdown. The floating docks rested unevenly as the water continued lowering toward the approved maintenance elevation, and several boats had already been relocated because their slips no longer provided sufficient depth. By mid-morning, county engineers, environmental inspectors, and representatives from the Homeowners Association had gathered near the marina trying to understand why the water level had changed. Standing quietly near the control structure with the inspection binder in my hands, I realized the conversation everyone expected to have about construction costs was about to become a conversation about ownership, water rights, engineering permits, and responsibilities that had existed long before the first marina design was ever placed on a drafting table. County engineers arrived before noon, parking their survey trucks along the maintenance road, while environmental inspectors unloaded measuring equipment beside the shoreline. The atmosphere felt completely different from the excitement of the marina opening only a day earlier. Conversations were quieter now, driven by questions instead of celebration. The floating docks had settled far below their original position as the approved maintenance drawdown continued exactly according to the engineering schedule. Wide sections of the lakebed were now visible, exposing the true elevation of the reservoir beneath the surface that everyone had assumed would remain unchanged forever. Karen Mitchell walked quickly toward the inspection area carrying a thick folder of construction plans and contractor invoices. Her confidence from the ribbon-cutting ceremony had been replaced by visible confusion. She asked the lead county engineer why the water level had been lowered without notifying the Homeowners Association. Before anyone answered, I quietly handed him the maintenance binder containing the operating permit, annual inspection schedule, engineering reports, environmental approvals, notification records, and reservoir management documents that my family had maintained for decades. The engineer reviewed the first several pages before recognizing the permit number immediately. He explained to everyone gathered nearby that the maintenance schedule had been submitted months before construction reached completion and that every required approval had been issued through the normal regulatory process. Karen interrupted politely, insisting that the association had invested millions of dollars into the marina and would never have approved construction if anyone had mentioned a seasonal drawdown. The engineer looked at her thoughtfully before asking a simple question. Did the project team request the reservoir operating records before finalizing the marina design? Karen glanced toward the contractors standing behind her. No one answered. Another inspector unfolded updated survey maps across the hood of a county vehicle, comparing recorded property boundaries with the completed marina. Colored boundary lines, easement locations, shoreline measurements, and reservoir limits were all clearly marked. The inspection team carefully verified coordinates using field equipment before documenting every observation with photographs. After nearly an hour of reviewing the records, the lead surveyor quietly confirmed that the marina extended into privately owned reservoir property without any recorded shoreline easement, construction license, or water use agreement from the legal owner. The contractors appeared genuinely surprised. Several admitted they had assumed those authorizations had already been secured before construction began because projects of that size normally required extensive legal review. The environmental inspector then explained another important detail. Reservoir management infrastructure cannot simply be suspended because new recreational facilities have been added. The annual maintenance cycle protects downstream safety, structural integrity, water quality, and long-term operation. Interrupting that schedule without proper engineering justification would create unnecessary risk for everyone depending upon the reservoir system. Standing beside the weathered concrete control structure, I listened quietly while the professionals discussed engineering standards, recorded property rights, and regulatory responsibilities. I never needed to argue because every conclusion came directly from the documents, permits, surveys, and inspections conducted by independent experts. As the afternoon sun reflected across the gradually lowering water, the expensive marina no longer represented a symbol of progress. It had become an unmistakable lesson that even the most impressive construction project cannot replace careful due diligence. Buildings, docks, and investments may transform a shoreline, but ownership, engineering obligations, and the law remain exactly where they have always been, waiting patiently for someone willing to read the next page before pouring the first foundation. The inspection continued throughout the afternoon as county officials expanded their review beyond the shoreline and into the planning history of the entire project. Survey crews placed temporary markers along the exposed lakebed while engineers compared construction drawings with recorded property boundaries, reservoir operating elevations, and historical maintenance data. Every new measurement confirmed the same conclusion. The marina itself had been professionally built, but it had been placed within a reservoir system whose operating conditions had never been evaluated during the planning process. The lead engineer explained that the annual maintenance drawdown was not an unexpected event. It appeared in archived inspection reports dating back decades. Water level records, engineering logs, and operating permits all documented the same seasonal procedure. Anyone conducting proper due diligence would have discovered those records before construction began. Karen listened carefully while flipping through the project binder prepared by the Homeowners Association. It contained architectural renderings, contractor agreements, budget approvals, and landscaping plans, yet one section remained noticeably absent. There was no executed shoreline license, no reservoir operating agreement, no water management consultation, and no signed authorization from the legal owner of the lake. The silence that followed said more than any argument ever could. One contractor quietly admitted that his company had relied upon information supplied during the planning process and assumed every required authorization had already been secured before construction started. The county surveyor nodded with understanding, explaining that contractors often depend upon owners and project managers to verify legal access before work begins. Responsibility for confirming property rights belongs at the beginning of a project, not after the final dock has already been installed. As the water continued lowering according to the approved schedule, the exposed lakebed revealed several original survey monuments that had remained hidden beneath the reservoir for years. County officials photographed each marker because they perfectly matched historical survey maps stored in public records. Those old concrete monuments, placed long before the subdivision existed, quietly reinforced every boundary line shown in the engineering documents. Standing beside one of those markers, I remembered my grandfather explaining why he insisted on preserving every inspection report and survey instead of assuming future generations would simply remember where things belonged. Records survive long after memories begin to fade. By late afternoon, the inspection team completed its preliminary findings. The reservoir maintenance operation had been performed exactly as authorized, exactly as scheduled, and exactly as documented. The drawdown itself required no corrective action because it complied with every applicable engineering requirement and environmental condition. Attention instead shifted toward evaluating the permitting process used during construction of the marina. Representatives from the County Planning Office requested additional documentation from the Homeowners Association, while environmental staff scheduled follow-up meetings to determine what future corrective measures might be necessary before the reservoir returned to its normal operating elevation. As the last survey equipment was loaded back into county vehicles, the setting sun reflected across the remaining water while sections of the marina rested above the newly exposed shoreline. Only 24 hours earlier, the docks had symbolized celebration and certainty. Now they stood as a quiet reminder that impressive construction cannot overcome missing documentation. I closed my inspection binder, locked the weathered control structure for the evening, and looked once more across the reservoir. Nothing about the maintenance schedule had changed because of the marina, and nothing about the law had changed because of the celebration. The reservoir continued following the same engineering plan it had followed for decades, patiently reminding everyone that successful projects begin with understanding the land before trying to transform it. Over the next several weeks, the reservoir slowly returned to its normal operating elevation according to the same engineering schedule that had guided its management for decades. As the water gradually covered the exposed shoreline once again, County agencies continued reviewing the documentation collected during their inspection. Representatives from the Planning Department, Environmental Services, and the County Survey Office held several meetings with the Homeowners Association, contractors, and consulting engineers. Rather than focusing on emotion or assigning immediate blame, every discussion centered on permits, recorded boundaries, construction procedures, and regulatory compliance. I attended only when my property records or reservoir operating documents were requested, bringing the same organized binders my grandfather had taught me to preserve. Every page told the same story it had told from the beginning. The reservoir had always been privately owned, the maintenance schedule had always existed, and the operating permits had always required periodic drawdowns to protect the long-term integrity of the dam and downstream infrastructure. Eventually, the county completed its formal review. Officials concluded that the reservoir maintenance had been conducted exactly as authorized, and that no violations had occurred during the controlled lowering of the water. Their attention instead focused on the approval process surrounding the marina itself. Because portions of the structure extended into privately owned reservoir property without the required shoreline agreements or documented authorization from the legal owner, additional corrective action would be necessary before the facility could be placed into permanent operation. County staff explained that no matter how much money had been invested, every construction project remained subject to established property rights and applicable regulations. The size of an investment could never replace missing legal authority. Karen attended the final review meeting with noticeably different confidence than she had displayed during the ribbon-cutting ceremony. She listened carefully while planners explained each finding, occasionally asking thoughtful questions about how future projects could avoid similar mistakes. The consultants recommended a comprehensive review process requiring property verification, engineering coordination, and legal documentation before any major construction affecting common amenities could begin. Several board members quietly admitted they had relied too heavily on assumptions because the reservoir had appeared to function as part of the neighborhood for so many years. Appearance, however, had never changed ownership. Following the review, the Homeowners Association voted to suspend use of the marina until every outstanding property issue could be addressed through proper legal channels. Some sections would require redesign, while other portions would need relocation to remain fully compliant with recorded boundaries and operational requirements. The contractors accepted the decision professionally, acknowledging that engineering solutions always begin with accurate information. Driving home after the final meeting, I stopped for a moment beside the old control structure overlooking the reservoir. The water had nearly returned to its normal elevation, gently surrounding the shoreline exactly as it had countless times before. Birds skimmed across the calm surface while evening sunlight reflected from the restored lake. Standing there, I realized the reservoir had never been trying to prove anyone wrong. It had simply continued following the same operating plan it had followed for generations. The real lesson belonged to the people who built around it. Land remembers its boundaries, water follows engineering, and the law quietly preserves both for those willing to respect them before drawing the first line on any construction plan. By the beginning of autumn, the reservoir had fully returned to its normal operating elevation, and from a distance the shoreline looked almost exactly as it had before the entire dispute began. The difference was no longer visible in the water itself, but in the way everyone approached the property surrounding it. County officials finalized their recommendations, and the Homeowners Association agreed to revise its planning procedures before approving any future capital improvement involving shared landscapes, waterways, or infrastructure. Every major proposal would now require certified boundary verification, title research, engineering consultation, and written confirmation from every affected property owner before construction could begin. Those requirements seemed obvious in hindsight, yet it had taken one expensive lesson for everyone to appreciate how essential they truly were. I attended the next association meeting at the invitation of the board, not because anyone expected another disagreement, but because several members wanted to understand how my family had managed the reservoir for so many decades without confusion. I brought a selection of historical survey maps, maintenance journals, engineering reports, and photographs showing the dam shortly after my grandfather completed major improvements many years earlier. As residents passed the documents around the room, they began recognizing familiar landmarks that had existed long before the subdivision itself. The old spillway, the inspection road, the concrete control structure, and even the weathered benchmark markers had quietly remained part of the landscape while generations of homeowners came and went. Karen listened with genuine interest as I explained that reservoir management involved far more than simply maintaining water levels. It required constant coordination with engineers, environmental specialists, county inspectors, and weather monitoring systems because every decision affected downstream waterways, wildlife habitats, and neighboring properties. She admitted that the board had focused almost entirely on how the marina would benefit residents while overlooking the larger infrastructure supporting the lake itself. That acknowledgement changed the tone of the entire meeting. Instead of discussing blame, everyone began discussing stewardship. The board unanimously approved a new infrastructure review committee that would include engineers, survey professionals, environmental advisors, and affected property owners whenever future projects extended beyond ordinary neighborhood improvements. Several residents volunteered immediately, saying they wanted to understand the land before trying to reshape it. Leaving the meeting that evening, I felt something far more valuable than personal satisfaction. I felt relief that the community had chosen knowledge over pride. A few days later, I walked the shoreline just before sunset, following the same path my grandfather had shown me as a child. The restored water reflected the golden sky while migrating birds settled quietly across the reservoir. The marina remained temporarily closed pending redesign, its empty docks serving as a quiet reminder that successful construction always begins beneath the surface with accurate information rather than impressive architecture. I stopped beside one of the original survey monuments that had briefly emerged during the drawdown before disappearing beneath the restored water once again. Even though nobody could see it anymore, I knew it remained exactly where it had always been, silently defining boundaries that neither time nor assumptions could erase. Standing there with the evening breeze moving gently across the lake, I realized the strongest foundations are often the ones hidden from view, patiently supporting everything above them long before anyone notices they exist. Winter slowly settled across the valley, covering the shoreline with a thin layer of frost, while the reservoir reflected the pale morning sky with remarkable stillness. The marina remained quiet as engineers completed revised drawings and survey teams marked new reference points along the shoreline using information gathered during the county review. Nothing moved quickly anymore, and that change alone revealed how much the community had learned. Decisions that once relied upon enthusiasm now began with measurements, legal descriptions, engineering consultations, and careful conversations between everyone affected by the work. I continued my regular inspection routine exactly as I always had. Every month I walked the crest of the dam, examined the spillway, recorded water elevations, tested monitoring equipment, and filed maintenance reports with the same agencies that had supervised the reservoir for decades. The process never attracted attention because properly maintained infrastructure rarely becomes exciting news. Its success is measured by the absence of emergencies rather than dramatic headlines. During one inspection, I noticed several neighborhood families walking along the shoreline with children who had never seen the exposed survey markers or the engineering diagrams displayed during the public meetings. Curious about the history of the lake, they stopped to ask questions, and before long I found myself explaining how reservoirs function, why seasonal inspections matter, and how every structure surrounding the water depends upon careful planning beneath the surface. Parents listened just as closely as their children, realizing for the first time that the lake was more than a beautiful backdrop for weekend recreation. It was an engineered system requiring continuous stewardship. A few weeks later, the Homeowners Association organized a community education day beside the restored shoreline. Instead of celebrating a construction project, residents gathered to learn about water management, environmental protection, and responsible planning. County engineers demonstrated survey equipment while environmental specialists explained how gradual water level adjustments protected fish habitats, downstream waterways, and the long-term stability of the dam. Karen welcomed everyone with a noticeably different message than the speech she had delivered during the marina opening months earlier. Rather than promising ambitious expansion, she spoke about respecting expertise, verifying information, and working together before making decisions that affected shared resources. Her words reflected experience instead of assumption, and the audience responded with genuine appreciation. As the afternoon ended, Several neighbors thanked me for preserving decades of engineering records that had ultimately helped everyone understand the reservoir more completely. I smiled because those records had never been collected to win an argument. They had simply been maintained as part of responsible ownership passed from one generation to the next. Walking back toward the old control structure beneath the fading winter sunlight, I paused beside the weathered steel gate and looked across the calm water stretching toward the distant shoreline. The reservoir appeared peaceful once again, yet beneath its smooth surface rested survey monuments, outlet structures, monitoring equipment, and carefully maintained systems that continued performing their quiet work every single day. Watching gentle ripples move across the water, I realized the greatest improvement our community had achieved was never the marina itself. It was the understanding that lasting progress begins with respecting the land, the engineering, and the people who have cared for both long before anyone imagined building something new upon them. 1 year later, the reservoir looked exactly as it had when my grandfather first showed it to me as a child, calm beneath the morning sun, framed by towering oaks, and quietly reflecting a sky untouched by conflict. The revised shoreline plans had finally been completed after months of engineering reviews, legal agreements, and careful consultation between every affected party. Portions of the marina had been relocated to comply with recorded property boundaries. Floating structures were redesigned to accommodate the documented maintenance schedule, and new shoreline easements existed only where every required signature had been properly obtained. Nothing had been rushed because everyone now understood that lasting projects begin with respect for the land beneath them. The community celebrated the reopening with a very different atmosphere than the first ceremony. There were no oversized promises, no assumptions about ownership, and no speeches declaring victory over nature. Instead, county engineers, environmental specialists, homeowners, and board members stood together, acknowledging the months of cooperation that had transformed a costly mistake into an opportunity for learning. Karen spoke briefly, thanking the professionals and residents who had helped create a process built upon documentation, transparency, and mutual respect. Her words were simple, honest, and noticeably different from the certainty that had once guided every decision. After the gathering ended, I chose not to remain at the shoreline. Instead, I followed the familiar maintenance road toward the old concrete control structure where generations of my family had quietly cared for the reservoir long before anyone imagined luxury docks or neighborhood expansion. The weathered steel gate opened with the same steady sound I had heard for years. Inside, the gauges displayed normal operating levels, inspection logs rested neatly on the shelf, and the control wheel remained exactly where the engineering plan required it to be. I completed one final routine inspection, signed the maintenance record, and closed the binder before stepping back outside. The evening breeze carried the scent of pine across the water while a pair of herons glided low above the restored shoreline. Looking across the reservoir, it became almost impossible to imagine how much confusion had once surrounded this peaceful place. The docks no longer represented conflict. The exposed lakebed had disappeared beneath calm water once again. The old survey monuments rested quietly below the surface exactly where they had remained for decades, continuing to define boundaries whether anyone could see them or not. My grandfather often reminded me that true stewardship is measured not by what people build but by what they choose to preserve for those who come after them. Standing beside the reservoir that evening, I finally understood the full meaning of those words. The greatest victory had never been watching expensive docks settle onto exposed ground during a scheduled maintenance drawdown. The real victory was seeing an entire community learn to respect engineering, property rights, and careful preparation before making decisions that affected everyone. I turned toward the quiet shoreline as the last light of day reflected across the water, knowing the reservoir would continue following the same dependable cycle it always had, patiently reminding every generation that nature, sound engineering, and the law do not compete with one another. They work together for those willing to understand them, and that quiet truth will always outlast the loudest celebration ever held along its shore.